I think the first thing that comes to most people's minds when they hear the word geography is probably a map. And that's fine because map reading is a big part of the subject. And we're going to discuss a little bit of it today, but we're going to discuss a lot of other things as well. So, maps are not the entire thing. And disclaimer, I am not an expert. I don't consider myself an expert by any measure. I just like learning new things and I like teaching people things. So, this is Geo Gems and I am Jewell. So, let's go back. We're going to talk a little bit about the history of geography, what geography is and what geography isn't. So, this is probably the most I will explain maps in this series, at least in this much detail, because to understand the history of geography and the importance of geography, you have to understand a little bit about mapping, which is what we call cartography. It's the creation of maps, right? That is the foundation of geography, so it's very important. Geography, the word, actually comes from a Greek word that literally translates into earth writing, right? So it's a writing about the earth. It takes into consideration anything that moves and everything that doesn't move on the earth and describes how everything kind of interacts with each other and then the results of those interactions. So it's like an explanation of a relationship between people and their environment, right? I like to think of it as a discussion about cause and effect because I strongly believe that there is nothing that anybody could do on this planet that doesn't directly or indirectly affect somebody or something else. And the way I guess you can kind of conceptualize it is if you think about that riddle, I call it a riddle, I don't know what else it is, where it asks if a tree falls in the forest and nobody's around to hear it, does it make a sound? Now, if we disregard the actual scientific answer for the question, which I kind of think is asking about whether it makes a sound or not and what sound is. So, when I was kind of reading up on what the answer to this question actually is, they were kind of talking about the fact that sound doesn't really exist unless there's a listener because sound is a vibration in somebody's ear or something's ear canal. So if there are no ears around, then it doesn't, nothing vibrates, so there's nothing heard. So therefore, it doesn't really make a sound unless somebody's there to witness it, you know, hitting the floor or whatever. Geography kind of focuses less on that and more on the tree actually falling. So it would go into the forest, it being geography, goes into the forest and it shows you, okay, this is where the tree fell and why it fell. Maybe a wind storm or, you know, soil erosion. I don't know. Something moved and the tree fell. And then what happened after it fell? Did it displace something from its environment? Did nothing happen? Well, I don't believe anything cannot happen. Like it shows you where it fell, why it fell, and what happened after it fell. So that's cause and effect. And then it goes a little bit further to say like what should happen after. So should you or should you not replant a tree to replace this fallen tree? So it's a cause, it's an effect, and it's a solution. Even though sometimes you don't actually look for a solution, geography will kind of present you with one anyway. But like if we look at it as more like a traditional Greek understanding of geography, they were more concerned with exploration and something called areal differentiation, which kind of focuses more on trends of the physical earth and then of whatever humans are living on earth, right? um so they were focusing more on the uniqueness of a geographical area. So it's asking the question, what makes this place different from another? What makes Trinidad so unique as an island in the Caribbean? What separates one part of Asia from another? Why is South America so different from North America? The Greeks were basically looking for a way to understand their own homeland in relation to other places that they would have known existed. So they had a lot of questions that they needed answers to, and they really weren't the only ones. Most societies were kind of yearning to understand things about their place in the world and the people and the environment around them. So if you think about how many like popular stories, myths that were just focused on people just going on journeys, that was the theme back then. And I don't think much has changed now. It's just like it's not as focused on that particular part. Humans are probably the most curious creatures that ever existed on this planet, and we're always trying to make some new big discovery about something or some place, always trying to find an explanation or a meaning behind something. I think seeking knowledge is what kind of drives us as beings. So the Greeks were among many societies who took particular interest in cartography, and we can't forget when we think about maps that is not a modern invention. The Greeks didn't create the concept of cartography. They weren't even the first ones to draw a map. Maps have been around since the beginning of time. So we don't really credit the Greeks with creating maps or inventing maps, but we do have to acknowledge that they had a big role to play in the development of what it is today. And if we include the Greeks, then we have to acknowledge the fact that the civilizations of the Middle East, they had a lot of contributions to the subject, and most of them were pretty groundbreaking in terms of what it is that they were studying and what it is that they found. So, aside from successful exploration missions that they would have had, where they would have documented different civilizations and presented information about how it is these societies worked and interacted with each other. The I would guess you would say the farmers or people that would have worked in agriculture would have sort of revolutionized agriculture and rearing of livestock because they would have studied how certain crops and certain livestock uh would have responded to different environmental changes, and they would have been able to acknowledge what conditions were most suitable for certain crops and what habitats would have supported different livestock. And this was not something that they happened upon in a day. This was season upon season upon season of observing fertility trends and flooding trends with the River Nile and the effects that those circumstances would have had on the produce that they would have been getting. And if it is to be acknowledged to that, then we have to acknowledge that the Chinese Empire, and there were several of them, would have had different technologies that weren't as accessible in the Western world. And their knowledge of astronomy and navigation would have made it a lot more simple to go about these exploratory missions that other countries were taking. So, first of all, when you hear the word technology, I don't want the first thing to pop into your mind like internet and computers and that kind of thing, because technology has a lot less to do with electricity than we think. Technology is not limited to things that, turn on or light up or that kind of thing. It's more about convenience. So anything that can make human life easier is considered technology. And the compass in this particular case was an extremely useful piece of technology that would have made these expeditions a lot easier, right? So people are venturing out into the world. They're looking for discoveries. They're hearing about all these nations that are prosperous and they're filled with technology and resources and that kind of thing. And many countries were like thinking, okay, we need to go out there and trade with these other countries or these other civilizations so that we can get in on this action, get a piece of the pie. And unfortunately, wherever there is prosperity, there is going to be colonization. And many textbooks would say, most of them actually would say that China was never actually colonized, right? But prosperity makes people a little thirsty, right? And that thirst would have drawn out the best and finest colonizers out of Europe. They were going out to sea and they were looking to trade. And by trade, I mean they were looking to get as much as possible by paying as little as possible. And for all the benefits that cartography would have had, it made it really it made it easier for colonization and imperialism and that kind of thing to be so successful. The British would have studied these economies, they would have studied these civilizations, they would have gotten this full picture of physical, the cultural, the social environment of Asia, and they would have been able to set up other colonies in other nations outside of China and surrounding China. Right? They would have understood the rule, and then they would have had allies in other European nations. So it's not even like about dividing and conquering. It's just about having power in numbers, right? Strength in numbers, that kind of thing. And the understanding of the rule made it easier to conquer it. Uh, if they were stuck in Europe, not going out there, not exploring, not researching, that kind of thing, I don't think it would have been as successful because they would have been going in blind, that kind of thing, right? So while I won't say that cartography is the cause, like it didn't make colonization happen, it just made it a bit easier in a sense. And it would have been able to explain a lot of things that would have happened. Map making was a pretty difficult process back then, so as you would see, a lot of cartographers got it wrong. For one thing, this was a time where majority of people couldn't grasp the concept of the earth being spherical, and Greeks actually believed that Greece was the center of the earth. Now we know better, but that was the belief back then. Homer, who was a Greek author, he believed that the earth was flat, right? And the description that he would have given was it was like a floating cookie in a bowl of water, which always happens to be moving. And there was a portion of Europe and Asia, and then a piece of land that they just referred to as Libya, which was what they thought to be the entirety of Africa. And then why not be dramatic? He thought like the edges of what was considered the world was filled with monsters and had savages and perpetual darkness and all that kind of good stuff. And then the oldest map of the known world, and I use known world because uh, keeping in mind that they would not have explored the entire globe at the time. So this was just up until like this is the point where they would have actually like physically known about. Right, so the oldest map of known world was drawn by another Greek, and his name was Anaximander. In his maps, you would find the River Nile, the Black Sea, but he thought that instead of just the earth being a flat cookie, floating in this bowl of water, it was cylindrical. And like the top of the cylinder, so like if you have like a roll of tissue paper and it rested on the table flat, the top part was where everybody lived. Uh and then the rest of the cylinder, so anything below that flat part, was just air. And this theory kind of went on, and theories like it would have went on for a while. Obviously all of them would have been wrong, and others would have thought that the earth was mostly flat. Like most people kind of just danced around that whole flat earth theory. And the reason why uh they couldn't really like say it was completely flat was because some people would have noticed that the sun would have risen at different times. So that means like it had to have some sort of difference in elevation, right? So they thought instead of just being like completely flat, then there had to be like a depression in the middle of this flat earth. So instead of it being like a tabletop, it was like a saucer, with a little dip in the middle. And after that, we kind of just rotated depending on who was doing the inspiring. It was back to the cookie, and then back to the saucer, and then new introduction of the rectangle. The Chinese astronomers kind of believed that the Earth was a square, but it can't be like a sharp square. It had to be a little rounded, it's like a soft square. And then there was Pythagoras, yes, that Pythagoras, who he actually was one of the first people who was like, yeah, nah, you're wrong. The Earth is definitely a sphere. And this was like around 560, 480 BC, so we're coming along a little bit. And he said that the Earth had to be spherical and had to have like a fiery core in the center. So that was pretty accurate for somebody of that time. And even though he would have, gotten it right, a lot of people just wasn't on board. And you can't really fault them because there are a lot of things that still puzzle us in 2021. We have all this technology and there are still questions that people are like, huh, that doesn't explain this, that doesn't explain that. And even with all that technology and data that we have, it's just some concepts are just not easy to bring people on board with. And they didn't really have as much technology and as much data as we had. So within the limited knowledge that they would have had, I can understand why things were a little bit sus, right? So for one thing, they didn't really understand gravity, and if the Earth is spherical, then it doesn't make sense. What happens to the people on the other side of the Earth? You know, they just couldn't get the image out of their head. Are animals walking around upside down? Are they sliding off the side of the Earth into space or whatever is out there and just dying? Like it's just nonsense. And then a lot of people were very religious, so it was kind of like sinful to believe that there were people on the underside of the earth, right? It was a big thing amongst early Christians. Like they didn't know for sure where the sun went at night, but they just refused to accept that there was some daylight having people on the other side while they were experiencing night. That just sounded pretty weird, right? And even more so, they just couldn't accept that there were humans, like just like them, on the other side experiencing a life just like them. They had to be different somehow. So, of course, savages, witches, because if they're walking around upside down with their foot in the air and that kind of thing flies on the ceiling, that sounds like some witchcraft to me, right? So I understand why people back then were so they were reluctant, and I guess to believe that the earth was spherical. And back then, it's understandable. This day, I can't get with that. Like, there's just too much information to still believe something like that. But it's hard to let go of things without proof, in a sense. And even with proof, you just need time to kind of get used to an idea. So even though Pythagoras, he did what he had to do, he brought his extremely difficult concept and he presented it, and most people kind of accepted it. But it was difficult for a lot of people, and they went back to the thing that made most sense, that was easier to explain. The cookie in the bowl of water. Greece is the center of the world. Monsters and savages on the outskirts. That's cool. And then Aristotle, another guy, he's the one who I guess would have swayed people a little bit more into the whole spherical idea, right? He presented pretty much the same theory as Pythagoras, but he had a little more reasoning, a little more explanation to go with it, and people took him a little more seriously than they did, and maybe that's why Pythagoras kind of gave up on the whole globe thing and went on to like triangles. Maybe that's more of his forte. Circles just not working out. I don't know. Aristotle, he had some pretty sound arguments. At least they thought it was sound. When I read them, I can't say he would have swayed me in any direction, but if it worked for them, cool, right? So it stuck. The whole spherical thing stuck, and it sounds like this might be unimportant. The shape of the earth. It might be like, what's the big deal? Flat, round, nobody cares. But it's actually really important, especially when we start to talk about things like climate. You'll see how just the shape of the earth kind of affects things like that. So we'll get into that a little bit more later on. Fast forward a few centuries, and after a lot of sponsored expeditions, we've collected a lot of data on the earth, the humans that live on it. Maps are still not perfect, but or at least written maps are not. Uh Satellite imagery is pretty much you get what you get, and depending on the type of map that you're looking at, there would be some significant differences regarding continent size. Uh we don't have this issue with satellite maps, but more so with written or paper maps, I should say. That's two-dimensional maps are where the issue is. And that's because of projection. So you're shown a portion of the earth, right? And it appears flat from your perspective in the same way that if you're standing on the earth, exactly where you are, everything around you looks like it's on a flat surface or relatively flat surface. And if you use Google Earth and you zoom out, zoom out, zoom out, zoom out, you begin to see the curvature of the earth. Things appear a little bit more prominent. And if you zoom all the way out, you're presented with a 3D image of the earth in space. With a paper map, that's not an option. So it's always two-dimensional. And I mentioned the word projection, and you've probably heard it a million times on social media in the past year alone. But in geography, it's a different type of projection. This has a lot to do with flattening. And we just spent all this time talking about how stupid it is to think of the earth as flat. Let's not say stupid, backward. To think of the earth as flat. And here we are trying to flatten it. And since that we've discussed that the earth is spherical, nobody kind of wants to walk around with the whole globe in the backpack. And we need to figure out how to make round earth flat, on a piece of paper so that it can be a little more easier to access. We don't want to leave anything important out. The easiest way to kind of grasp what projection is what we call the orange peel theory. And you have to think about the earth as being an orange, right? The map is the skin of the orange, the peel. And imagine yourself, you peel an orange, you're really good at peeling, and you get the whole skin off one long curly piece, no breaks, right? And then you're trying to get that skin to lie completely flat on like a table or a plate, and you can't have any spaces. It has to be can't be one long strip. It has to be like a flat, full, accurate display of what this orange would look like, but just two-dimensional. And I'm pretty sure your brain is having a really hard time trying to picture getting this orange peel flat, and that is because it's impossible. And that's why we have projections. So Gerardus Mercator, he had the Mercator projection as like the most popular projection that exists today. It's mostly used for navigational purposes, and there's a few issues with it. Why other like it doesn't fit for other uses and that kind of thing. So we're gonna get into that. So he came up with the way to get the whole skin flat, but he had to make some adjustments, right? And in order for this to work, uh the adjustments just have to happen, and we call those adjustments those distortions. So the wildest thing for me was discovering that depending on the map that you're looking at, some things aren't exactly the way they are. And one of those things is continent size. So some countries actually aren't big as they appear to be in real life. So Greenland, for example, if you go, you open a map, as long as it's using the Mercator projection, which most maps do, Greenland and Africa are going to pretty much look like the same size. Very small differences in size. You're gonna notice, which is extremely inaccurate because Africa as a continent is actually 14 times the size of Greenland. And just for a visual comparison, that's like comparing a bottle cap, so like water bottle cover, to like a legal size piece of paper. The difference is extreme, but that is not what's presented in most I guess maps, atlases, that kind of thing. You just don't see that. Um Another example would be the size of Europe in relation to South America. South America is actually almost twice the size of Europe, and that's including Russia. No, not the entire country of Russia, because only 25% of Russia is actually considered Europe, and the rest is Asia. Um, yeah, so it's still a pretty big piece. And on the map, South America looks pretty much almost the same size as Europe, because we're always told Russia is huge, so it makes up a really big part of Europe. And then Europe itself is presented as a pretty large piece of, you know, land. But in comparison, it's really not that big, you know? And then the next one would be Alaska. Alaska looks bigger than Mexico on a map, but it's actually smaller by about 200,000 square kilometers. And so like these are the discrepancies that kind of come up with the Mercator projection. But it wasn't, I won't say the map it was wrong, because the purpose of the Mercator projection wasn't to show continent size. The purpose of it was to help with navigation, because um all projections have its faults, no matter what element you want to sacrifice. It's either accuracy or it's aesthetic. It's accurate in certain regards and not accurate in others. And it's not useless. Like the Mercator projection, I won't call it useless as long as it's used for its intended purposes. The Mercator was used for navigation, so it would have sacrificed the continent size accuracy in order to prioritize direction. So if you want to compare, we want to compare that map to the Gold Peters projection. And it looks pretty weird, but it's actually pretty accurate in terms of relative size of the continents. But because of all the distortions that it would have had, it doesn't really make a good projection for navigation. So mapping, navigation in a sense, is highly dependent on the lines of latitude and longitude being exact. And Peter missed the mark completely. Like the more he tried to accommodate, well, it's more than one person. The more they tried to accommodate continent size, is the more they had to distort the lines of latitude and longitude, because remember, it's not flat, it's a round shape, and they're trying to flatten it out. So that something just has to go, no matter what, something has to go. And it's a pretty accurate uh presentation of land size, but it doesn't work if you're using it for navigation. And these discrepancies are kind of what makes me hate certain terms that they would use to describe certain continents, because just like how these two maps, they would have had their purposes, it just wasn't always accurate. It wasn't used for its intended purpose, and a lot of things kind of get skewed. So terms I wish no one would ever use again: first world countries, third world countries. I mean, nobody really acknowledges second world countries or fourth world countries, but first and third are always kind of what comes up. And we've tried to make it sound a little bit nicer now. So now we're using global north and global south, But that's just like a sly way of saying filthy rich and dirt poor. And people gravitated towards the Peters projection for a similar reason. Like they thought the Mercator projection was inaccurate because they were upsizing northern countries in comparison to southern countries, and it kind of it emphasized the idea that bigger is better and bigger is superior. Anything that was considered inferior was like less deserving of rights, resources, acknowledgement, freedom. So you see where this is going. This is in similar fashion with the whole first world, third world country division. I think it's dangerous and it's highly inaccurate. And personal opinion, there are some first world countries that I think don't fit the textbook definition of a first world country. So, you know, it's a bit off there. So division I think is backward. Yeah, it's backward, it's outdated, it's discriminatory, and it favors Western ideas more than it favors anything else. And yeah, I just wish no one would use them anymore. Yeah, I think it's more important to acknowledge the truth, because the third world division, it doesn't acknowledge that most third world countries are like the major contributors of the same natural resources that are used to allow first world countries to have the financial security that they always boast about. First world countries struggle with the same social issues that third world countries do: extreme poverty, being like number one. And the only real defining factor for how you fit into these categories is GDP, which once again I don't think it's an accurate definer. A country itself could be making tons of money in in foreign investments, and the citizens could be suffering, right? And the whole global north, global south thing is just a whole next way of saying the same thing. It has nothing to do with direction and everything to do with making sure that you're not falling into the whole poverty category, or at least perceived poverty. I think as citizens of the globe, we need to understand the impact that these terms have. And it's not just about politics and international relations, but like on your own personal psyche. If you're always taught to believe that you're destined to suffer because of where you are situated, physically situated, that is, there's a certain amount of motivation that you just don't have as an individual. And most of us will kind of go our whole life kind of not thinking about things in the whole global north, global south, first world, third world perspective. But we've been indoctrinated to believe that for some reason you will never reach a certain level of success as long as you live in a certain country. We tend to think that the Caribbean has nothing good to offer except beaches and a fun time. And if you want real power and you want real opportunity, you You want advancement, you either go Europe, you go US, or certain Asian countries. If you want to express uh compassion and charitability, you find yourself on some crusade somewhere in South America or some mission in northern Western Africa, because that's where all the starving children gather. Uh, we don't we didn't just do these things ourselves, obviously, but we continue to keep it alive. The whole global north has always had they always had these views about countries of the global south as this kind of play then. That's where the fun and the party, masquerade, that's where the relaxation comes in. It's exotic, it's mysterious, where all these savage and exciting people are. At the same time, we're poor and helpless, we're politically and religiously oppressed. You know, these are the views that make it so much easier to kind of hold on to these cultural fetishes that most of them kind of want to live out their fantasies with, and they want to be the savior of the nation, that kind of thing. And we've been programmed by them to kind of view ourselves as lesser than in comparison to the rest of the world. And then at the same time, within our own undeveloped bubble, which is the Caribbean, we always looking for a way to rank ourselves uh as better than others, using the same stupid criteria that these global north countries use with us. A lot of Trinidadians, I've noticed, genuinely believe that we have more to offer than other small islands because we've managed to develop our economy in a particular direction using oil and gas. But it's not that we're more developed, it's just that we've developed differently. There are a whole set of negative consequences that we have from relying on fossil fuels for income that other countries don't. And then other countries have negative consequences that we don't experience as much because of their reliance on tourism or on agriculture or that kind of thing. And compared to the global north, together as a region, we face the same challenges, like the same challenge. We all, as one region, face the same challenges as a result of their development, especially because uh we feel certain consequences are a bit harsher just because of where we're situated, climate change being the major issue, right? We do ourselves the injustice when we put energy towards the whole who's better than who in the whole global race, when we're always put at the bottom no matter what. And I would love if everybody was to never use first world, third world, global north, global south terms ever again, especially us who are in the position of being called, third world all the time. Um, instead of doing that, like just say it like it is. Say with your chest, right? We can't realistically group the countries of the world into two and three boxes. We could barely decide which countries belong to seven continents. So like how is that how that making sense? Right? Instead of using categories that accurately reflect what it is you want to talk about. Um yeah, it might have a lot more categories to use, but at least they would be accurate. If you want to say a country is technologically undeveloped, say that. Don't say third world. That doesn't mean poor. It doesn't mean third world. And former colonial powers of the Western world doesn't mean first world, doesn't mean rich. It means that you probably got rich by stealing, but it would paint a more honest picture of the countries that are financially on top. Like, think about how much more accurate it would be to define particular groups of nations based on similar qualities, especially in the Caribbean. Like, without using the word first world and third world, like how would you describe your region or countries within your region? Um, like use accurate terminology, especially if you're a geography student or somebody who interacts with geography students. You might think well, who am I? I'm just some small fish in the sea. Who cares if they use first world? Who cares if somebody considers me third world? Like, I don't believe I live in a third world country and that's all that matters. But it does matter because we are the future leaders of, the world. And we're the policymakers, we're the activists for change. And you don't want people to be responsible for citizens of your country and then accepting the fact that there's only so much that can be done because you're a third world state. Like it's a very limiting place to start. There's a lot of history behind why it is we are the way we are, and a lot of people like to compare geography to history. But I don't think it's about comparison. I think instead of comparing it to other subjects, it could be more considered to like a part of other subjects. Geography is what makes other studies possible. Without geography, a lot of vital information would be lacking from biology. Ecology would make a lot less sense if we had no idea why certain habitats existed where they do. Uh, as we established before, geography is what made trade possible between wealthy nations or, you know, nations who wanted some wealth. Uh, and history would make absolutely no sense without a clear picture of where civilizations would have developed. And it's not just about map reading, as we already established. There are a lot of maps, yes, but oftentimes it's more than just location. It's about understanding space and place. And if you truly understand what those are, then you can understand geography. Space and place is just not just physical. It's political, it's cultural, it's emotional, and it's constantly evolving. And thanks to like advancing technology, it's 100 times more efficient to record and analyze raw data and be able to come up with solutions to everyday problems. This is the reason why we could confidently say ice caps are melting at alarming rates. It's how we can predict and monitor the weather. We could track oil spills across the globe. We could monitor coastal erosion, sea level rise, and we could analyze population growth, distribution, spread of diseases, impacts of natural disasters, a pandemic, right? Um, Geography has so many mapping techniques. It provides a clear picture of how things are happening, when things are happening, why things are happening. So, for example, the cholera outbreak in London back in 1854, they were able to one, trace it back to one source of contaminated water using, unfortunately, a map of deaths in each neighborhood, and the concentration of deaths would have led back to one particular area, and then it would have been able to source it back to that one source of water. Geography focuses on so many topics at once. It's focusing on distribution, it's focusing on land use, it's climate and weather, it's natural disasters, it's health, it's politics, it's culture, it's a lot of things. And since we spend so much time talking about maps, I feel like it's important to understand like just one more, and then we could like close it off. We circulate on social media every 2 seconds. I don't know these logistics, right? But it's the map of Palestine, right? Um, I remember the first time I heard about this issue. I think it was 2018. It was not long after I graduated. I was watching a documentary, Al Jazeera documentary actually, about boycotting Israeli products. And honestly, back then, social media was not the way it was now. It had a lot more room. Had a lot more room to ignore tragedy, and this kind of went over my head, unfortunately. And then last year, I came across it again, and I kind of saw it with fresh eyes. Uh, And I finally understood what was really going on, and it's a lot. A lot of people will hear about it from certain sources, and they would hear Palestine, and then the first thing pops into their mind is Islam. And we know that we're conditioned to think about Islam in a particular way. And once we associate this issue with the other issues that we already have programmed into our mind, we instantly kind of just square it away as this is a religious thing, right? And yeah, we're not gonna get into that. That's what happens. But first of all, it's not a war. I don't consider it a war. And it has a lot less to do with religion and everything to do with land and power. Because if we say it's religion, it's unfair. There are Christian Palestines, there are Jewish Palestines. In the same way, there are also Muslim and Christian Israeli citizens. Uh, so it's not about religion. All right, that's not the major issue here. Um, Israel has been slowly and forcefully seizing portions of Palestine land from indigenous Palestinians since before 1960, and the areas that are still occupied by Palestine might as well just belong to Israel because they're operating under Israeli law. They've set up shop in a very strategic way so that Palestinians cannot travel back and forth between Palestinian communities without passing on Israeli roads, meeting up with Israeli military, having to cross Israeli borders. And just imagine yourself, you live in the West and you cannot go to Grandy because the entire bus route is inaccessible to you because you live in the West. And think about what that means for trade, for healthcare, food supply. If one country's government can control what happens to your resources, your economy, your people, all their rights are being infringed upon, the land that you live on, that you've lived on for decades, that your parents have lived on, your ancestors have lived on, is no longer considered yours. The government of Israel's goal is not to share. If they wanted to share, they'd have done that already. The goal is to take over all the land, including the land in Jordan Valley. And the Jordan Valley has a river which is the main water supply for that whole entire region. It's a very agriculturally rich area as well. So this is food. And Israel's government justification for these acts is by saying the land was already theirs, so you can't steal what's already yours. After World War One, when the United Nations divided the land amongst the people that were already living on it, and the Israel, I would call them refugees because they were fleeing, World War One. It didn't take Israel very long to begin encroaching on Palestine land, and that kind of just kept on getting worse. This didn't happen 2 years ago. This is not a new issue. This has been going on for decades, and that's why Palestinians just don't believe that there's any real hope for them living peacefully together, because of the history that they would have had. It's a huge pile of human rights violations that has been going on for years. And I can't say for sure what the perfect solution is. I wouldn't even begin to guess what it is. There just seems to be a a lot to think about. And the Israeli government has made it clear that they have no interest in accepting that what they're doing is wrong. And I understand wanting a space to call your own, but just not at the expense of somebody else. And I think in situations like these, people as us, as people who live on the outside, like we could sympathize about what's going on, but we don't truly know what it's like to live there and experience that firsthand. And three things are very important to remember in situations like these. One, you need to stay informed and be careful about where you get your information from. Not just with this issue, but like with all issues. Fact checking is your best friend. It's very important, especially with the news. Like, not just because it's a legitimate news station or a legitimate site, it doesn't mean that they are reporting all the facts without bias or prejudice. You would hope that that's the case, and that's why I don't watch live news. I prefer to read things, and that way I could compare many different written sources at the same time and look for discrepancies. I'm not saying go and play detective, just be aware that as long as people are reporting something, there will always be prejudice. And some countries' news broadcasters will have a lot more prejudice than others when talking about certain issues. Uh, and most of the time, they're not very hard to spot, especially if you understand a relationship between different countries. Two, don't spread misinformation. Uh, Performative activism is a real issue. It happens so easily because many times we're in a haste to kind of join the tragedy train. We don't really understand that spreading misinformation is actually worse than not saying anything at all. Uh, and most of the time, we could unknowingly spread things that we think are helping, right? Just take a moment, look at what you're about to share, do your research before you hit that share or retweet button or whatever. Just research information, research the person or the site that is actually sharing information if you can do that. And as long as it feels like, yeah, this seems accurate, there are, you know, other corroborating people or whatever that can say this looks good, then, by all rights, go ahead. And three, don't let your own personal prejudices and biases color over the truth, right? We may not be able to physically unravel the tension that's happening there, but we could definitely not contribute to it. There is no quick and simple solution to issues like these, and if we expect to find one, then we are severely misled. What does help is not adding fuel to fire. Nobody loves a good debate more than myself, and it's so easy to turn a nice, healthy debate into a keyboard battle, and that's where things get really nasty. If it is we feel like somebody is not hearing us or they're refusing to accept our point of view, it can get ugly, right? And the older that I get, I kind of realize that you can't reach everybody, can't change everybody's mind, can't fight every fight. You could, I mean, you could try, but you probably just end up like you're really angry, very unfocused, and instead of adding more negative energy to a situation by trying to berate, shame somebody into getting on the same page with you, you can dedicate that same effort, that same fight that you have to actually reaching people who are completely unaware or a little bit hesitant to come on board, not completely unwilling, just a little hesitant, right? And when you're on social media a lot, there's really no room to ignore tragedy, there's no room to ignore suffering. And you feel this like constant pressure to kind of be that change in the world. And sometimes you feel like you're not, like you're doing a lot and other people just aren't. It's a lot of stress, it's a lot of anxiety, because you kind of feel responsible for things, even though you haven't actually done anything wrong. And if you feel that way, just imagine every individual feeling that way, that same anxiety, and some people more than others. You know, to say there is no one person who could change the world. There's no like you are not responsible for single-handedly fixing the system. And before you go out there and drag somebody for not doing as much or not doing more, like just take a moment, think about the approach that you have, and if you wouldn't appreciate it, like just don't do it to anybody else. Instead, focus on educating and encouraging and empathizing a little bit, you know, and that really could go a long way. Thank you for listening till the end of episode 1 of Geo Gems. And if you enjoy it, give it a like. If you didn't enjoy it, let me know why. Feedback is important. Share it with a friend or a geography student or anybody who just likes geography. And then ask me some questions. If you have any, you can leave a comment, DM me on Instagram or Twitter, whatever. Yeah. Bye.